He said it like I wasn't standing 5 feet away. "She's just the assistant," he told the journalist, chuckling as he reached for another drink. A few of them laughed politely, glancing at me like I was part of the decor background staff. Clipboard in hand, heels quietly planted near the wall. What they didn't see was everything. The 20-page run of show I built, the late-night vendor calls I handled when he was too tired, the contracts I proofread, the emotional fires I put out without ever letting them reach his desk. I didn't just assist. I constructed. I wasn't a footnote in this story. I was the architect. But to him, I was convenient to forget. And that night, in that grand ballroom with its golden chandeliers and echoing glassware, something inside me snapped into place, not from rage, from clarity. I'd spent too long making myself smaller so he could shine, and now he was convinced the spotlight belonged to him alone. It wasn't the first time he'd dismissed me, but it was the first time I no longer flinched. I stood still, invisible to them but not to myself. I looked at the envelope inside my bag. Thick, sealed, final. My name was on that contract, not his, not as a proxy, not as an assistant, as a partner. And in 3 days at the gala where the press would swarm, where he expected me to stand in the wings and clap, I would walk onto the stage, take out that envelope, and sign it in front of them all. Not to embarrass him, not to prove a point, but to reclaim every inch of credit he'd swallowed whole. The strange thing about being underestimated for so long is that you learn how to move through rooms like air, silent, unnoticed, and yet completely essential. Over the years I learned to predict his moods before he spoke, to reorganize his calendar before conflicts arose, to clean up after his mistakes without asking for praise. At first I told myself that's what made me good at my job, but over time I realized it wasn't a job anymore. It was a system of erasure. I wasn't building something with him. I was building something for him and letting him put his name on it. He used to call me indispensable in private, in moments of gratitude or stress, but as his star rose, that word vanished. Now I was just the assistant, just the one behind the curtain, just the one who carried the folders, just the one who didn't matter in a headline. I began keeping copies of emails, of contracts, of receipts, not out of spite but out of self-preservation. There was always this tiny fear that one day I'd be wiped out of the picture entirely, and no one would know I was ever there. But that fear began to shift into something else, something steadier. I no longer wanted revenge. I wanted presence, recognition, ownership, and when the board invited me, not him, to speak at the gala, I saw it for what it was, my moment. Not for spectacle, not for vindication, but for truth. And I decided then that I wouldn't shrink into the shadows when it arrived. I would walk through the same doors he did, look out at the same crowd, and hold the pen with a hand that finally felt worthy. I spent the next few days preparing in silence. Not the kind of silence he imposed, the one where I swallowed my thoughts and made myself small, but the kind that felt sacred, focused, powerful. I booked my own appointment at a tailor for the first time in years, choosing a deep emerald dress that felt nothing like the black uniforms I used to wear at his events. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not the board, not the other coordinators, not even my sister, who had always warned me about giving too much without being seen. I wasn't hiding. I was savoring it. Because this wasn't about him anymore. It was about me walking through a door I built with my own hands. I rehearsed my short speech in front of the mirror, adjusting my tone, my pacing, my stance. I made sure I sounded like someone who belonged on that stage. And with every word, every breath, every line I practiced, I felt something returning. A version of myself I had tucked away beneath his shadow, the one who once believed she could lead without asking permission. On the night of the gala, I arrived 15 minutes before call time. He was already there, mingling near the champagne tower, laughing with a group of donors. He didn't notice me walk in. He never looked twice. And maybe that was the last favor he unknowingly gave me. That indifference was the permission. I needed to stop waiting for his gaze. I stepped backstage with the folder in hand, heart steady. The lights were bright, the room was full, and my name was printed on the program. Not as assistant, as partner, as keynote, as something no one could claim but me. The ballroom was a sea of opulence, glittering gowns, polished shoes, diamonds flashing every time a hand lifted a flute of champagne. For years I had worked this same event from behind the curtains, radio in one ear, checklist in hand, making sure the night flowed without a ripple. I knew the floor plan by heart. I knew which lights were too harsh on camera, which speakers needed adjusting, which guests would try to sneak into the VIP section without a pass. I had made this event seamless for him every single year, and yet I had never once been listed as part of the official team. That night, as I stepped out of the dressing room and caught my own reflection, emerald green against the backdrop of gold, I didn't see just the assistant. I saw the woman who had built this empire while watching someone else take the credit. My heels echoed differently this time. Not rushed, not hesitant, grounded. I made my way to the main floor, the familiar route now feeling entirely new. People turned to look. Some recognized me but hesitated, unsure of how to place me outside of the clipboard and headset. Others smiled politely, assuming I was someone's date. I said nothing. I didn't need to explain myself anymore. When I reached the edge of the stage, I caught sight of him standing near the center table. He hadn't noticed me yet. He was mid-story, gesturing as if he were the star of the evening, and maybe, to them, he still was. But I knew what was coming. In exactly 13 minutes, they would call my name, and I would walk past every table, every whisper, every glance, not to ask for space, but to claim what had always been mine. When they announced me, the applause was polite, confused. Even most didn't know who I was. I saw faces tilt slightly, eyebrows raise, eyes scan their programs for clarification. And there it was. My full name, printed in bold, beneath the title Strategic Partner and Contract Co-Founder, not assistant, not support staff, not a ghost. For a split second, the room seemed to pause as I climbed the steps. I heard my own heartbeat louder than the music that faded behind me. The stage was warm under the lights and I could feel the weight of their stares, but for once it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like breath, like arrival. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately. Inside was the final version of the joint venture contract, the one I had negotiated, revised and earned. My pen rested where it always had, tucked neatly in the spine. I took it out, clicked it, and signed on the final line in front of 300 guests. The board, and most importantly, him. I didn't look at him right away. I didn't need to. The energy had shifted. I could feel it behind me, rippling like a thread pulled tight. When I finally glanced his way, I saw him frozen mid-sip wine glass hovering, expression unreadable. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was embarrassment, or maybe, finally, it was recognition. I gave no speech. I simply stepped back from the podium, nodded respectfully, and exited stage left with the same calm I had always given others. But this time, it was for me. I had signed with my own name, in my own time, on my own terms. And nothing he said, from that moment on, could erase the ink that now told the truth. Backstage, no one stopped me. No questions, no praise, just a few curious glances from interns and junior staff who had never seen me in heels, let alone command a stage. I walked past them with a soft nod, heart still steady, the contract tucked under my arm like a quiet shield. In the hallway, I paused beside the same supply closet I used to reorganize during breaks, the one where I'd once cried silently after he dismissed my proposal in front of a client. I almost laughed at the memory. How strange it felt now, not bitter, just distant. Like an old scar you remember but no longer ache from. I leaned against the wall, took a slow breath and allowed myself a moment to feel the shift. I didn't feel triumphant in the loud, victorious sense. It was subtler than that. It felt like an exhale I had been holding for years. Like slipping into clothes that finally fit. I checked my phone. 3 messages from board members congratulating me. One from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. Was that you on stage? I'm so proud. And then, at the very bottom, a single message from him. Why didn't you tell me? I stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. But what could I possibly say that wouldn't sound like revenge? It wasn't revenge, it was release. It was clarity. I locked the phone, slid it into my bag, and walked out through the back exit. No spotlight, no encore, just night air on my face, and a quiet knowing in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was walking toward myself. The morning after the gala, I woke up before the sun. Not from nerves, that part of me had quieted, but from a kind of unfamiliar peace. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee in hand, watching lights slowly slip through the blinds. My phone buzzed constantly. Articles, congratulations. Even a podcast clip already dissecting the unexpected contract reveal at last night's event, but I didn't open any of them. I wasn't interested in headlines or gossip. I knew how they worked. I had written press briefings myself, coached others through media spins. They'd ask if I did it to embarrass him, to reclaim something dramatic, but they'd miss the point entirely. That moment on stage had nothing to do with vengeance. It was a quiet declaration of presence, of ownership. I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not even him, especially not him. I thought about the years I had molded myself around his vision, his voice, his needs. How many times I had rewritten my schedule, my emotions, my goals, just to keep things smooth. And for what? For someone who believed I was a replaceable fixture? Someone to stand beside the success but never inside it. I used to think that loyalty meant silence, that if I worked hard enough, long enough, he'd eventually say my name in the light. But now I understood. Some people build their throne from borrowed hands and never look back. And that's fine, but I wasn't borrowing anymore. I had signed something more than a contract last night. I had signed off on that old version of myself, the assistant who waited, the woman who watched others take credit. She was done. This version, the one drinking coffee with her name on the papers, was just getting started. Later that day, I went into the office. I didn't need to, my role had shifted now, and my responsibilities had expanded well beyond the day-to-day. But I wanted to walk those hallways one last time before I chose whether to stay or go. I passed the reception desk where I used to arrive first and leave last. The interns whispered as I walked by, and one of the younger coordinators, someone I had trained months ago, stood a little straighter when she saw me. I smiled at her, not as a superior, but as someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked. The door to his office was open. He stood behind the glass, pacing, phone pressed to his ear. When he saw me, he paused. For a second, he looked like he might wave or even step out. But he didn't. Instead, he turned his back and continued talking, as if the gala had never happened, as if my signature wasn't already inked into the future of the company. And that told me everything I needed to know. There would be no apology, no acknowledgement, no change. Just a man who lost control of a narrative he thought would always revolve around him. I walked to my desk, the one I had kept spotless for years, and opened the drawer. Inside were old notes, color-coded timelines, and a framed photo from the early days, back when he used to say, "we." I left the photo, closed the drawer, and took only what mattered: my laptop and the folder with the official copy of the contract. As I stood up, I didn't feel sad or bitter. I felt clean, like I had finally emptied a space I had long outgrown before I left the building. I paused by the wall of plaques near the elevator, the one that showcased every major event we had ever organized. His name appeared on almost every one, etched in gold script under titles like Executive Director or Lead Strategist. I searched quietly for mine, knowing I wouldn't find it. My contributions were always too invisible for bronze, but I didn't need a plaque anymore. That night on stage had been my inscription. I pressed the elevator button and waited, listening to the familiar hum of printers and distant laughter from conference rooms. It was strange, realizing how many years I'd spent breathing life into this place, only to now feel like I didn't belong to it, or more accurately, that it didn't deserve to belong to me. The elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, staring at my reflection in the mirrored panel. I looked different, not in appearance but in posture, in presence. For so long I had shrunk myself to fit this space, adjusted my voice, my pace, my dreams to make room for someone else's ego. But now, I stood tall. No clipboard, no headset, just a woman who had rewritten her role without asking for permission. As the doors closed, I imagined the next steps: new meetings, new partnerships, places where I would be introduced, not as the assistant, but by name, by merit. And maybe someday I would work beside people who saw me before I had to prove myself. Maybe I'd build something from scratch again, but this time with my name on the foundation. The elevator reached the ground floor with a soft chime. I walked out without looking back. The chapter had closed, and this time I was the one who turned the page. The first meeting after the gala wasn't held in a high-rise or a glossy boardroom. It was in a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop, the kind of place where people didn't speak in rehearsed pitches, but in real conversations. I met with two women I had admired from afar for years, founders of their own consulting firm. Women who had once worked under men who took credit for their brilliance too. They had reached out after the gala, not with fanfare but with clarity. "We saw what you did," one of them said as we sat down. "Not the signature, the silence before it." I smiled, still surprised that people noticed the quiet part. They asked what I wanted next, and for the first time in a long time, I answered without hesitation. I told them I wanted to build partnerships where power wasn't taken, it was shared, where visibility wasn't a reward, it was a given. I wasn't interested in playing catch-up in someone else's empire. I wanted to help shape one where no one had to shrink to be accepted. They listened. They nodded. They didn't flinch at my ambition, and that felt radical in itself. Before we finished our second round of tea, they offered me a seat at their table, not as a guest, not as a courtesy, but as an equal. I accepted, not out of desperation, but with intention. That night had opened a door, but this meeting helped me realize I could walk through more than one, that the world didn't revolve around his approval anymore. It never really had. I had just been standing too close to see the rest of the horizon. Now, I was finally stepping into it on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, I let go of more than just my old job. I let go of the rhythm I had once thought made me valuable, being the first one in and the last one out. Answering emails before sunrise, staying silent during meetings so others could speak over me. I began reclaiming my mornings. I took long walks without my phone, sat in bookstores without an agenda. Learned to enjoy my own company without measuring it by productivity. The shift was internal, but it showed in everything. The way I stood, the way I spoke, even the way I dressed. I no longer wore neutral tones to disappear into the background. I chose colors that made me feel alive. I started mentoring a young woman who reminded me of myself at 23, full of ideas, terrified to interrupt. I told her, "You're not here to fill a seat. You're here to take up space." She cried when I said that, and I realized how many of us had been waiting to hear those words. I spoke at 2 conferences, consulted on 3 major campaigns, and watched my name appear finally, not in footnotes, but in headlines. And still, he never reached out again. No apology, no confrontation, just silence. But that too felt like a gift. The absence of his voice left room for mine to grow louder, steadier. People asked me if I was angry. I wasn't. I was awake. I had spent too many years asleep under the spell of being needed without being respected. Now I was writing my own script, and it didn't include waiting in anyone's wings. The spotlight I had once feared was no longer blinding. It was warm, and I had earned every flicker of it. One afternoon I received a thick envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name, written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a printed draft of a memoir he was apparently writing. The title, From Vision to Victory, Building an Empire. I flipped through the pages, unsure why he had sent it, until I reached chapter 6. There, buried in the middle of a paragraph, was a sentence. None of it would have worked without her. No name, no details. Just that. A vague nod tucked between business jargon and self-praise. For a moment, I stared at it, wondering if it was meant as some sort of olive branch, or worse, a consolation prize. It wasn't acknowledgement. It was avoidance, disguised as tribute. I placed the pages back in the envelope and slid it under a stack of donation letters I needed to sort through for an upcoming charity event I was now co-chairing. That's where I was now leading, not assisting. And I didn't need a footnote in his legacy to validate mine. My story wasn't a side note anymore. It was the headline of my own life. That same evening, I wrote a short essay about women who work behind curtains and how often they are never allowed to step forward. I published it online without fanfare, expecting maybe a few friends to read it. But within a week, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Women from all over the world wrote to me. Some were assistants, some were CEOs. All of them had lived versions of my silence. And together, they turned my small reflection into a wave of collective truth. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt part of something bigger, something that would never again be erased. Months later, I was invited to speak at the same venue where the gala had taken place. But this time, not as a last-minute addition or surprise signature. I was the headliner. The stage I had once crossed in someone else's shadow was now fully mine. As I stood behind the curtain, I took a moment to look out at the audience gathering. Students, organizers, CEOs, artists, a crowd of women and men who had read my words, followed my story, and come not out of curiosity, but out of resonance. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. When they introduced me, I walked with purpose, heels clicking like punctuation on polished floors. The lights didn't feel harsh. They felt like alignment. I spoke not about revenge or bitterness, but about dignity. About the quiet women who power every success story without being named. About how it's not ambition that threatens people, it's visibility. I told them what I wish someone had told me, that being behind the scenes doesn't mean you don't deserve the front. That credit isn't something to be begged for, it's something to claim. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was intentional. A standing ovation not for theatrics but for truth. And somewhere in the back of the room I saw a woman cry silently, her hands trembling as she clapped. Recognize that tremble, I had lived it. And in that moment I felt something greater than success. I felt impact. I wasn't just sharing my story, I was unlocking doors for others to walk through, and no one could take that from me. No title, no dismissal, no forgotten introduction could ever again shrink the space I had now claimed. I had arrived. And, this time, everyone knew my name. After the talk, people lined up to speak with me, not just to congratulate me but to share their own stories. A teacher who had written hundreds of lesson plans only to be passed over for a promotion. A designer whose concepts had been credited to someone else for 5 straight seasons. A nurse who trained every new hire while being called support. Staff for over a decade. They didn't want advice. They wanted to be seen, heard, named. And I gave them what I could. Eye contact. honesty, and the same sentence I had once whispered to myself in secret: "You are more than the role they've written for you." I stayed long after the lights dimmed and the seats emptied. At the back of the hall, someone had left a single bouquet of wildflowers with a card that simply read, "Thank you for reminding me who I am." I carried it home like a medal. Not because it made me feel important, but because it reminded me that truth leaves ripples, and those ripples become change. Later that evening, as I sat on my balcony under a navy sky, I thought about all the moments that had once made me feel small. The times he introduced me as the assistant even when I had rewritten the entire campaign. The looks I received when I spoke too confidently in meetings, the way my silence was expected and my presence overlooked. And yet, those same moments had forged a fire, a clarity not of vengeance but of voice. I didn't rise in spite of those things. I rose because I finally stopped believing they were true. And now, every step forward felt like a promise, not just to myself but to every woman still waiting to be called by her real name. A few weeks later, I received an invitation in the mail, thick paper, embossed gold lettering, the kind he always preferred for company events. It was for a celebration marking the firm's 10th anniversary. My name was listed on the guest list, this time with the title, Founding Strategic Partner. It was strange seeing it written so clearly, the kind of title that should have been mine long ago. But what caught my eye wasn't the invitation itself. It was the post-it note slipped inside, hastily written in familiar handwriting. "You were always more than I admitted. I hope you'll come." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I folded the card gently, placed it in the drawer beside the original contract, and closed it without hesitation. I didn't need to attend to prove anything. I had already rewritten the ending. That night, instead of going to the gala, I sat with my mentee at a small local showcase she had organized her first. I watched her take the stage with a trembling voice and fire in her eyes. Afterward, she ran up and said, "Did I do okay?" And I told her the truth. "You didn't just do okay. You stood where they didn't expect you to, and you held your place. That's more than okay. That's power." She smiled through tears, and I saw a reflection of the woman I used to be, only stronger, earlier, freer. I had spent so long waiting for someone to see me. Now, I was the one doing the seeing, and it mattered. Maybe the most powerful signature I ever left behind wasn't ink on paper, but the permission I gave others to rise. And you. Have you ever been called by the wrong name for too long?